Welcome to Washington in Focus. I'm Carlene Johnson with the Center Square, and our investigative reporter TJ Martinell is published a story on Monday, pretty shocking in-depth piece on Washington lawmakers' insatiable appetite for taxing and spending and what this is going to mean for the state's piggy bank in just a few short years. This is pretty remarkable and a little bit scary, TJ. So take it away. Tell us what you've uncovered.
Well, the long and short of it is that in 10 years, their spending has increased by 116%. And inflation has risen by 35%. So this is far outpacing inflation. Our population has not increased by any sizable amount comparatively speaking. It's not like we had a huge influx of new residents. So there's just been, and it's been in a couple of specific areas where the spending increased. One of them was public education. To be fair, that was actually not so much of a spending increase in some regards. It was also a shift from local funding to state funding, because in 2012, the state Supreme Court ruled in the McCleary decision that the state was not fully funding education and that they could not use local levies to pay for basic education. So it would be very, very difficult to know how much was actually being spent on basic education back then compared to now, but it has increased. But you have the Health Care Authority, you have the Department of Social and Health Services, you have long-term care, you have just general apportionment. These have all increased by at least 100% or almost, if not more. With the case of long-term care, spending has increased by 230% or 39%. So just a lot. And another thing to keep in mind is this is state spending, but also there's some federal dollars involved. But what that means, for people who say, well, the state's not spending the money, the state is also dependent on federal spending for it to maintain whatever it's doing right now within these areas. So if the feds decide to cut their spending to maintain these existing services or, pay salaries, benefits, whatever, the state would have to foot the bill. So that's kind of the situation we're in.
So you mentioned education, healthcare authority, long-term care. I'm thinking of with the long-term care deductions that come out of all of our paychecks now that we're required to have. They did have to, I would think, to facilitate that program, hire a bunch more employees for that particular agency. So how much do we know at this point, the increase in, these particular agencies, the biggest offenders, how much of it is new hires to manage new programs versus just, I don't know.
That's something we're going to be looking at. We're going to, because right now we're looking at how much did spending increase, and now we're going to figure out what's causing the spending increase itself. So that's where we're kind of at right now, is figuring, we need to figure out what is causing the spending increase.
Okay. And I know you spoke to some folks, that kind of study state fiscal policy, and people are going, Hey, pay attention. This is going to get really bad. What, by 2028? Is that what you found?
They are on track to go into a budget or a fiscal deficit of $400 million by 2028. But that's if they don't do anything, and they're going to have to. But the question is, what are they going to do? Are they going to cut spending? Are they going to use emergency funds? So this is where I think the thing that should scare people is that this is a fiscal crisis that is occurring at a time of record revenue levels. They have never been receiving this amount of money in taxpayer dollars in the history of the state, and they have a fiscal crisis. If the feds decide to cut spending or funding, the state, which they are, and if the state were to experience a economic recession of some kind, they would be facing a really, I can't speculate how much it is, but they were facing it. Inslee was talking about a $16 billion, when he was governor, was talking about a $16 billion budget shortfall. If they have a recession, they could face a $30 billion shortfall. And then they are going to back during the Great Recession, the state legislature understood you can't raise taxes in the middle of recession and expect to use that to plug budget gaps. You've got to cut spending. So that's kind of the issue of like, is the current legislature capable of understanding that and saying, hey, we are spending too much money? Are they going to say that, or are they going to do what they did this legislative session and react to a budget shortfall by basically passing the largest tax increase in state history?
And then the other big unknown, it could be even worse than it appears now by, the next revenue picture that we get. Yeah, with all these new tax increases, increases in B&O, what's that going to do to businesses and increases in the estate tax? Are we going to see some sort of wealth flight? I mean, think big unknowns that are out there that could make this even worse.
Yeah, it's interesting because, and this will be a separate story on itself, but there's this concept of the Laffer curve, and it's this idea that if you over a certain tax percentage or tax rate, revenue actually goes down. So you want to tax at a point where it's not so high that the revenue starts going down. For people who've seen Ferris Bueller's Day Off would get the reference. But I mean, that's what one lawmaker told me is where our state is going to experience less revenue than it expected because it raised taxes so high. So the amount of money that they're going to get, and the state could in fact trigger its own internal recession that doesn't apply to other states because of its tax policy.
And yet we've got other even bright blue states, California, even that are kind of starting to see some of this and slowing down. Washington seems to be an outlier after the session ended. I remember speaking to some I think it was the Tax Foundation, and their folks going, you guys are going in the opposite direction than even other bright blue states when it comes to tax increases. So it just, it's shocking.
Yeah, we're in a very interesting situation politically in Washington state. And this is what Jason Mercier over at the Mountain States Policy Center told me is Washington is such an outlier for every state around it, where it is raising taxes at a time when other states are cutting taxes and reducing spending or keeping it at the rate of inflation. And that's it. But they're not doing what happened this session where they had a budget shortfall amid record revenue. And their response was, well, we need more taxes. And eventually reality is going to kick in. And the question is, to what extent are lawmakers going to detach from reality and say, we don't have enough revenue, even when they have more revenue than they've ever had? At what point are people going to understand we do not have enough money and we are not going to get that money through taxes? Is that going to occur? Or are they going to just say we need a wealth tax and we need to pass an income tax? We need to raise the capital gains tax. We need to just all these other things as a way of not dealing with the fact that you don't have enough money to cover the spending that you're doing. And that's a completely separate issue from what are you spending the money on and what are we getting out of it? And I reached out to some lawmakers for comment on that and didn't get a response. I also reached out to the governor's office for comment on the story, didn't get a response. And so I think that that's the biggest question a taxpayer should ask is we're spending all this money, was it worth it? And what are we getting out of it? What were the accomplishments? What were the achievements? How has that made Washington State better?
I anticipate, based on even recent comments from Governor Bob Ferguson about the federal level cuts, Medicaid, and how we're going to backfill things like Planned Parenthood if that gets cut here in Washington. We're going to make sure that we're going to spend money on that. So I can anticipate that as the 2026 session gets underway, it's going to be a lot of blaming what's happening at the federal level for the need to potentially even raise more taxes.
And I think that that's probably a very accurate prediction, a very good one, because that seems to be what's going on is instead of saying we're spending too much money, they just say it's the federal government's fault, it's Trump's fault, as opposed to as if that's the only reason why Washington State had a fiscal crisis before Trump was even elected to office again. like last year when Inslee was talking about it. So it's for the average person who doesn't keep up with the center square and our coverage, that would be easy to fool. But for people who are informed because they listen to us and they read our stuff, they understand, no, we had fiscal problems before the election, before anybody got elected and before any spending was cut. So they're not going to be able to say, oh, this is entirely the federal government's fault.
When you did reach out, I know you reached out to like Senator June Robinson's office or whatever. Are you getting like zero response for your email or phone calls? Just not even decline to comment response?
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah, because I reached out and I said, hey, here's all this spending that's increased. What do you think are the top achievements and accomplishments with the spending? And do you think that these spending levels are sustainable? And also, if you guys have to do any kind of spending cuts in response to the forecasts, how high a priority are these things? And didn't receive a response. And like I said, I reached out to Governor Ferguson's office for comment, asking similar questions and didn't hear anything. The Tax Foundation declined to comment because they deal with taxes, specifically not revenue, which makes sense. They're called the Tax Foundation, not the Revenue Foundation.
Well, that's
the Standing Foundation.
I would really encourage anybody, who is interested. It really is kind of a scary scenario, knowing what could be coming if they don't sort of get a handle on their insatiable appetite, and start to make some corrections, sooner rather than later, because we're going to be in big trouble. And like you say, bring on a recession or something, which is always a possibility. And then the whole picture gets that much worse. But TJ, thank you for all the investigative work you do on this. Are you going to give us a teaser for what the next salvo is in this series?
I'm working on a story about a program that's currently being funded by the state. And so with this whole fiscal crisis, it's good to look at what are they spending their money on? What do they consider worth, paying for, as opposed to, like we talked about with your story recently, that medical center for infants who were born to drug addicts, that they didn't want to spend $100,000 on. But there's other things that they're willing to spend a lot of money on, that would, the taxpayers deserve to know. Your state is spending itself out of, spending more money than it is bringing in. And here's what it's spending that money on. So
it's going to be fascinating. Well, I can't wait to read the next piece that you put together for us. TheCenterSquare.com is where you can find TJ's story on the Washington page this week. And for now, along with TJ Martinell, I'm Carlene Johnson. This has been Washington in Focus.